The next type of sample, or the one that we're talking about in this video, is the cluster sample. All right, and I've already kind of taken the cluster, I've already created the clusters, and the clusters were basically created out of our original page of all these rectangles. Now, what you will notice is each cluster has some big and some small, and hopefully it's correctly broken out as close as possible. The idea of a cluster sample, as you will see on a previous page, is it's broken into smaller groups or clusters that are representative of the population. In other words, each cluster should look like the population. It should be a microcosm of the population. It should have some big and some small, all right? So how do you conduct a cluster sampling? Well, cluster sampling basically says, I have all these clusters. In this case, I happen to have 20 clusters. And I would randomly select one cluster and then survey everything in that cluster, all right? So we randomly select one cluster and we survey everything in that cluster. Now, cluster samples are very useful because they already look like the population. Unfortunately, it tends to be difficult for humans. And if we consider just the practical of our high school, it'd be pretty difficult to do that. So think about Texas or San Antonio. How would you divide San Antonio into clusters that looked alike? And you go, well, maybe I'll do it by zip code. And I'm going to say, well, do you think 78258 looks like something on the south side? Or do you think Alamo Heights area looks like this, et cetera? So it's kind of difficult. When we go to break it up by high school, you go, well, how about by advisory? And it's like, well, no, that would only have freshmen. My advisory would only have freshmen. It wouldn't be representative of the entire school. Well, what about band? Well, then it doesn't represent those kids in athletics. So it'd be very difficult to represent the entire school through cluster sampling. So humans is kind of difficult to represent through cluster sampling. So you're probably going, gosh, well, is it even useful? And the answer is yes. Doctors use it all the time. When they draw blood, they take a small sample, and that cluster that they put under the microscope and count out is representative of all the blood in somebody's body. So that's a cluster sample. When I worked in construction, we would take samples from a concrete truck, a very small sample, but it represented all of the concrete in that truck. So basically, it's very useful for some things. In fact, you use it at home whenever you bake something. When you take if you're making soup, you stir it up and you take one spoon and that full of it, and it represents it. On the other hand, chocolate chip cookies or brownies, when you taste the batter that you're tasting represents the entire batch. You don't have to taste all of it. You just taste one spoonful, and that one spoonful has all the ingredients mixed together. It has the flour, it has the sugar, it has the butter, it has the chocolate chips. It has everything mixed together. And once you taste it, you have a representative sample of the entire batch. Now, another part of the cluster sample is when you take a cluster sample, you have to sample all of it. You don't sample just part of it, you sample all of it. So if I go to the store and I'm buying a box of chocolates for my wife, I would expect one box of Russell Stover chocolate truffles to be the same as the one next to it, is the same as the next one next to it. So if I wanted to test them, I would buy one box, and because there's multiple different types of candy in it, I would have to taste each one of it to have a cluster sample. But the box of chocolates would represent a cluster sample in that every type of chocolate, truffle chocolate that they sold was in that box and was the same as the box next to it. So basically, we randomly select a cluster and then we try everything in it. So when I did this, I did a random sample and I ended up with cluster 16. So these are what cluster 16 had in it. All right. So you can see it had a 2 and a 2 is my smallest. It had some small ones. It had a medium and had a couple large ones in there. When I did that, I ended up with sizes 4, 6, 2, 12, and 18. In other words, all of these were in there. I added them up, took the average, and I had 8.4. Pretty decent cluster. Once again, clusters represent, look like little microcosm of the population. They usually aren't that good for humans, but they work well for other things. And once again, you randomly select a cluster that looks like the population, then you conduct a census. I said that word. We randomly select a cluster, then we survey everything in it, and surveying everything in it is a census. All right, so that's a cluster sample.